Leland, Quay, everyone. Good to see everybody and to know that we are all together in this space and time. And I will start with a song from my area. My name is Patricia Solis, and I am from Nugutguk, which is Topic First Nation in New Brunswick. I am Wolastoqey, otherwise known as Meliseet, and we are hoping to host the visioning gathering that's going to be coming up. And so I am supporting the work of this group as part of the leadership, but also as a cultural support to the work itself. And so I'm very honored and would like to share a song from our watershed, the Wolastoq song that my cousin Gwen Bear actually came forward with. And while she's on her spirit journey for some years now, we definitely love and honor the song that she brought forward to our nation and to everyone as a way of connecting to the rivers around us. Thank you, grandmothers and grandfathers, for giving us our lives, for giving us this time together, to come together, to speak from our hearts and also our minds about the work that we do and how important it is to honor our grandmother, Grandmother Moon, who gives that connection to all of life. The moon brings so many teachings, and I am so honored and so grateful to be together with all of my brothers and sisters at this time. I hope that we have a great discussion and that we keep our spirits and souls happy in sharing our thoughts and our hearts together today. Waliwan.
So our leadership team at the moment is Stephen Nita from Nature for Justice, Patricia Solis, who we just heard from, and who opened us with that beautiful opening, who's with the Maliseet Nation Conservation Council, David Flood from Wekotuen, and who's also an advisor to the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, Trish Nash from UINR, Kim Neal from Natural Assets Initiative, and Eli Enns from Isaac Olam Foundation. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Darcy, and Darcy is going to give us a little introduction about Gwen, and then we'll head off into our topic and our discussion.
Hi, everyone. I'm honored to be here. I'm calling in from the territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam people, and I'm part of the operations group with Mary Kate and Kim. And yeah, we're really excited to kick these full moon dialogues off. And the topic today is around ethical space, and it felt like a really important container to begin with. Just looking at the faces and names on the call, recognizing that the space of Indigenous-led conservation finance brings people together and has to happen with so many different sets of expertise and different groundings and different perspectives. And you all represent coming from many different spaces and organizations, and whether it's from governments, Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments, from NGOs, from the business community. The work is going to involve bringing together all of those perspectives. And so the intention to create a container for us to explore what does that ethical space mean in the context of conservation finance felt like the right place to kick off our full moon gatherings. And we're really excited that Gwen Bridge is going to share some of her work that's also draws on the work of Danica Littlechild, who is a key member of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. And Gwen is joining us also from BC, and she runs a consultancy and has worked in a lot of different contexts with nations across North America and at home in British Columbia, working to connect natural resource management visions and authority and self-determination together, and has made some real contributions in the work around ethical space.
Thanks. Hi, Darcy, for the introduction, and to all of you, Mary Kate and all at the RAD Network for inviting me here today to share some of the experiences I've been having in working in ethical space and collaborative negotiations in this new era of legal pluralism and UNDRIP implementation, particularly, as Darcy mentioned, in BC, where I currently reside. I am a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation out of Alberta, though, but have been living here in BC for quite some time. And I'll go quickly through this presentation on ethical space. I've been doing a lot of work after having thought for, as we do, our careers in trying to understand what needs to be brought forth into some of these conversations. And so if ethical space is predicated on deep understanding of each other, this is one element of understanding around ethical space that I'm going to bring to it. So instead of just talking, I do have a presentation that I'll walk through. It's a short presentation, about 20 minutes, and we'll have, as was mentioned, time for discussion through the breakouts. I know many of you are familiar with the concept of ethical space and being so close to Danica, really as one of my mentors in ethical space, along with Reg Croshu, of course, and Ermine, Willie Ermine. So that's where we kind of pick up from some of the background that we're anticipating building on in all of our work as we reform our policy and legislative spaces. So I'll try and stay on time. So I have about 20 minutes. Okay, so that's 27:37. Okay. And yeah, I think I won't be monitoring the chat, but if we do have questions, particularly of clarity, if you don't understand something, do reach out during the presentation, because I want to make sure that you're able to continue to absorb the information. But as was said, we'll do breakouts after. So it's a really short presentation for me. Typically they are longer, but we'll see how we do. And first off, by going down. So this is, if you guys read Operationalizing Ethical Space by Danica Littlechild, she talks about this in her words there. And this is, it didn't come as a result of that. It was independently sort of generated through the work that I have, but essentially following the same concepts of this idea of getting ready for engaging in meaningful and appropriate dialogue with First Nations in ethical space requires some preparatory steps. And so one of those preparatory steps is really this core middle. Never mind the arrows, this is beta version. I didn't update it, but really thinking about what's needed to be understood in order to have these conversations, foundational understandings really And then following that is this need to prepare organizations for engagement. There's oftentimes a lot of impediments, say in policy or structure or governance, that impede the type of relationships that we're wanting to do. So that exercise is called the Rapid Reconciliation Readiness Assessment, is a diagnostic and prioritization tool for organizational readiness. And then the third layer is in preparation is engagement planning. This is where people want to start. They want to start sort of going out and meeting with people and sort of developing relationship. But I'm, along with Danica, really cautioning that there's these fundamental understandings that need to be built about ourselves and the other, really. But primarily this trajectory of awesomeness, as it's called, for lack of a better name, is really about how do we get prepared to have ethical space-based conversations predicated on a deeper understanding and commitment to understanding of the other. So this is just a framework for moving through that. This presentation that I'll talk about is about in that core understanding. And there's a lot in there, right? There's all the history, the residential schools, the protocols and perspectives of Indigenous people, the history of colonialization, the constitutional legal frameworks, all of this kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of work there, and this is not the place to delve into that training. Most of you are pretty grounded in a lot of that work. What premises the offering that I'm making into that core understanding space is really this understanding of what UNDRIP obligates the nation states to do and how we begin to frame out the conversations that we can have within a context of understanding nation state and Indigenous governance interactions through the legislative framework. There's a couple things I just point here out. UNDRIP really in shorthand, it obligates the states to acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights, protect those rights, and then pay to protect, redress, mitigate impacts to those rights. So we're on this sort of trajectory of continually building towards the fulsome implementation of these components as they're articulated within the very specific articles, which you're mostly all familiar with. We talk a lot about two-eyed seeing or thinking, you know, how to do this collaborative thinking based on two ways of knowing and two worldviews and stuff like that. And I know working with one of Tricia's colleagues, Albert, and his explanation of this two-eyed seeing concept, right? About how we need to understand the other person seeing. I really like that metaphor because it provides this tangible, sort of visceral reality to understanding that metaphor is that if we're trying to head somewhere, if we're trying to achieve a vision or hit a target, and we only go with our one eye closed, if you close one eye, right, you're heading, and that's fine, you'll hit your target if you go in a straight line or whatever. But as soon as you open the other eye, you're going to miss your target, right? And so this is really important because in the framing of the collective vision, that needs to be done together so that we can, as we're thinking and moving with these two perspectives, reach that target. And so that's one of the fundamental premises here. And I really appreciate that two-eyed seeing metaphor, but it's really important to frame where we want to go, our targets in terms of societal evolution together. So I like that metaphor also because it really moves well into ethical space, which is really these two components, these two eyes, if you will, these two sets of information needing, as Reg outlines here in his drawing from the Voices of Understanding document he put together with the Alberta Energy Regulator, that it's not an overlap. It's not trying to find what's common. This ethical space is about the creation of something new, right? And in terms of these two societal components, trying to really think about creating something new. In BC, we're mandated through the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act to really think about the implementation and acknowledgement of legal pluralism. So these two components, how do they work together? This is the conversation in ethical space, right? And so really liking that metaphor too, because what's coming in from each of those eyes is really important. And so, you know, what comes in from each of those eyes? Of course, on the Western side, we have, you know, the notions of leaderships and the roles of politicians. We have this notion of science, Westernized science. We have religion. Our society is really still predicated on this understanding of the supremacy of the Christian God. I'll talk a little bit about that. Values, you know, different sets of values, this notion of patriarchy, what that means and its legacy for all of the Western components of society. This Asian Enlightenment, or the notion of continuing to take a more reductionist point of view of understanding the earth. Democratic governance, right? Constitutions and where that comes from and what is the importance of democratic governance within this society. And so those are things that are pretty well understood by most players. I would argue sometimes more well understood by the Indigenous people at the table, because they're very well versed in constitutional law, case law, the religious legacies of residential school, all of that kind of stuff. We're collectively indoctrinated through our school systems in Canada to be really embodying the assumptions contained within the Western system. And so what ethical space asks us to do is to bring what's important from that in, but also bring what's important from the Indigenous side in. And this is where so much of the work needs to happen in understanding what traditional ecological knowledge is, understanding the significance and relevance of stories and the protocols and prescriptions derived and developed from them. The role of leaderships, different nations have different concepts of the role of chiefs, for example. Different sets of values. I know in the Cree culture in Saddle Lake, we're taught the Cree law, and the first one is to love one another, right? And so how do you really embody that as an important component of commitment to following Indigenous law, for example, within ethical space? It's an interesting question. So there's different sets of values. Indigenous governance, I'm pretty sure not all the governances in North America were democratic. Well, what were they? And how are nations taking approaches to reinvigorating some of those traditional governance mechanisms, co-developing or coexisting with two different governance mechanisms, or perhaps adopting more westernized values of democracy within their communities? So there's a range there, but it's important to understand what could be. This notion of spirituality and what it means for decision-making. What are the inputs from the spiritual realm? How do they impact decision-making? What's happening within that process of consideration of the spiritual elements within Indigenous decision-making? Not super well understood, I think, by the Western stuff. So that's we have to bring more of that in as Indigenous people. Reg's request of Indigenous people was to take on the onus of bringing that understanding to the space, take responsibility for making it understandable by the other, right? And so I think that's a really important consideration. And in this work, part of what I'm going to share with you today is trying to bring forward some of that understanding in a way that can be understood collectively. So that's what we'll do now, very briefly. So when we talked about reconciliation in this age of reconciliation, if you will, right, we're all trying to be reconciliationists, right? And so the reconciliation is really this question of the resolution of conflict, right? Well, what is the conflict we're trying to resolve, right? And so we were finding in community, I do a lot of work on the Indigenous side, representing them in negotiations and conversations with proponent and government. And we would find ourselves in conversations, well-intentioned, well-meaning conversations framed as consultation or relationship building or whatever else they were framed in. And these conversations would leave us with this sense of dissatisfaction, right? We would be like, well, they wanted to do the right thing, but we still weren't feeling heard. Many of you probably have this same experience. And so why is that? Why are we feeling this dissatisfaction from this meeting where people were trying to say, well, what are your values? We want to respect and incorporate your values in this kind of thing, right? And it's like, well, that's okay. But the question remained to us was, as by way of example, this lady about 10 years ago or so from the Assis Indian Band was saying to us, well, it's okay. Like the developer came and they built a development over my blueberry picking patch, my huckleberry patch. It's like, and she said, that's okay though, because I just go and I just ask them if I can walk through the development to the next blueberry patch, right? And so the question is, well, is that reconciliation, right? It may be, she seemed to be all right with it. The developer was probably all right, government was probably all right, but it still leaves this feeling of dissatisfaction because you're resolving these questions on one-offs, on temporal or spatial explicit parameters, right? We're going to pick blueberries here, or we're going to put a housing development, right? And you may or may not have that resolution within that particular thing. But the problem when we look across the fragmented landscape is that conversation continues to be deferred, right? To the next block, to the next development. And so you're having these repeating conversations, and they were very dissatisfactory. So why are we having the conversations which are dissatisfactory? What is underlying the perspective of the non-Indigenous who come to the meetings to well-meaningly solicit feedback around values and perspectives and priorities from Indigenous people? And so we began to think about it. This was developed when I was in conversation with Rob Edward, a colleague at the Lower Similkameen Indian Band. And so we thought, well, what gives the person that belief in their authority that they make decisions? They have the authority to make decisions over land management. And they may or may not, depending on the legal and moral and ecological frameworks or contexts, consider Indigenous perspectives. And so we sort of peeled back this onion to understand where that assumption of authority, human entity and organization, comes from. And so we peeled it all the way back to this God and creator entity. And I'll just get into it and explain it. I think that's usually the best way here. So I have a little pen. Hopefully it works here. Let's see. I have a writing screen on my, you guys can see that? Yeah, okay.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So, and what Reg did was what this ethical space provides this framework for really comparing and contrasting and building understanding. So this conceptualization of this offering into ethical space was an understanding of the legislative frameworks, the hierarchical nature of authority within societies. On the left-hand side here, we have the Western society, on the right, the Indigenous society. So we said, well, where do those people's beliefs come from about the authority of humans to make decisions over the land, right? And they're so different from ours. And so we said, well, what are the things that are in common between the societies? Well, we all essentially believe in this notion of God or creator, right? On the Western side, we have a God who created all the things, all the animals, all the plants, et cetera, land, water, and whatnots. And on the Indigenous side, that's the same. Most Indigenous societies have a similar type of creation story. It's almost a pan-human characteristic. And again, this is my point for my caveat. This is based on my experience, my identity, my relationships, and it's not meant to be a panacea or reflect any kind of perspective on the validity of this or other Indigenous perspectives of this. This is just one offering into the space. And so these things on both sides, these God and creator created all the things, right? And then what happened? And then what happened on the Christian side, on the Western side, is that God delegated the authority for making decisions over the land base, that is for determining the fate of not only the humans themselves, but the fate of the animals, et cetera, to the human entity, right? So God said, go and make good decisions, I hope. And we know kind of there's a big bunch of stuff that happened when that didn't happen. But the delegation was, you get to have the authority, human entity, particularly male in this case, but this human entity to make decisions around how your fates will manifest on this earth, and you get to decide. Use the animals for food and all that kind of stuff, and use it wisely. But essentially, it's your authority. This is manifested, and now we have obviously the king. This is a little outdate. And my American colleagues are like, well, the human entity, okay, whatever. So it's the human entity. And so by way of example, to really illustrate this, well, I'll just go through this. And then, so then the human entities, they frame out, parameters by which to live, constitutions, legislation, policies, and then management plans, right? I'll leave science there for a moment. And so, by way of example, about this hierarchy continues to influence those assumptions I was talking about, people who come to the space. We were working with Parks Canada on the National Park Reserve negotiations in the South Okanagan, Similkameen, right? And we're in the negotiation, we're doing an MOU, right? This is kind of like, okay, let's pull it together and get it together and agree on some stuff. And so Parks Canada said, well, we should bring in the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, right? We're like, oh, that sounds good, like how to be kind and nice to each other. Wonderful. Let's take a look at that document. And so that document is really interesting because it forms sort of this highest level of Canadian law, if you will. It's like a constitutional element, right? And within that document, the first line of that document is, we believe in the supremacy of God, right? And so, well, that seems innocuous in a way. And it's, by the way, signed by the Queen, right, which is the head of the state, the sort of representative of this authority to follow the determinations of this, the delegated authority. So the Queen signs it as our, quote, head of state. And it says, reaffirming we believe in the supremacy of a God. Now, what that says is we believe in the supremacy of a God who delegated the authority to humans to determine their fate and the fate of natural creation, right? So we're like, well, we can't really endorse that, right? Because on the Indigenous side, we have something different. We have a creator who delegated the authority for making decisions about what should happen to the earth and the animals to the animals and the plants themselves, right? And so in the case of the indigenous nations, and reflect on my caveat there, this is really utilizing what I understand, and it's really going to be showcasing an example of the Okanagan Nation, who's been so grateful to share a lot of their understandings with me and endorse the sharing of those as examples with this framework, which is, by the way, called the dual authoritative hierarchical framework, if you want to make reference to that. So this creator comes and creates all the things the same as the other side, right? But he says to the animals, I'm going to create a human, right? And this human's got no fangs, no fur. It's going to be pretty flimsy and feeble, right? When it comes. And so you animals get to decide what happens to that human. You animals are responsible for your creation and manifestation of your relationships amongst each other, you animals and plants and all things, right? You're responsible for those relationships amongst each other, but you're also now responsible for determining the fate of the human, right? And so in this way, luckily for the Okanagan, the animals got together and said, we're going to give of ourselves, our lives, our bodies, et cetera, to support the humans. In return, those humans will have certain obligations to us, right? And those obligations are contained within story, and they really form the essence of what we're pulling together in our current colloquial lexicon as this traditional ecological knowledge, right? So that knowledge about those relationships between the animals and between animals and humans come from and come with the highest level of the law, in that the authority for determining how those relationships continue to be manifested on the land, that authority was given to the animals, right? So when Indigenous people talk about Indigenous law or natural law, this is what they're talking about, is that the actual animals have the authority over the humans, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about this just to the end of it, but just to sort of follow this TEK, really, all of that knowledge about the natural world contained in stories, contained in observational things, comes with an inherent authority that those laws are higher than human law, right? And so this manifests in our work sort of through story, and those stories contain protocols and prescriptions, right, for living, and then we get to living. And in the case of the MOU, right, as by way of a short example, there is this idea that we bring in the National Parks Act, right? And so the essence of ethical space in this particular negotiation is to bring in the appropriate horse story. We're looking for the same behavioral guidance instructions, right? The National Park Act says, well, we're going to not pick endangered species. All right, well, so let's look at the available material within the Okanagan Library of Stories for a story which contains the similar behavioral guidance, right? i.e. law, right? So that law and that behavioral guidance is all framed within those stories. So we bring into the MOU this equality of understanding between the appropriate legislative framework. So often, traditional ecological knowledge sort of gets relegated to the realm of science, right? And so science is awesome. I have a master's in science, love it. But science is something which doesn't carry any inherent weight. Like we think about climate change, for example, if the knowledge that the Earth was providing as interpreted by science, listened to by society, we would be behaving very differently in relation to science. But it always gets subjected to these policy validation loops, right? And we know policy, right? Who got lobbied, how much money there is, consistency with other policies, all of that scientific information gets compromised. The challenge in the conversation we've been typically having is people want to incorporate, include, and consider Indigenous knowledge, TEK, within science and put it into management plans, right? And so this process is essentially an automatic subjugation of this entire system of living and legislative framework and behavioral, the Indigenous society to a policy validation framework or a policy validation loop, right? And so that's a huge problem. And this is, exemplified in another example. I was working with the Policy Institute for Watershed Governance out of UVic, writing this plan to provide recommendations to provincial government on some new Water Act implementation. So this whole plan, and throughout the plan, they're like, we really need more TEK in this plan. Wouldn't that be great? Oh yeah, it'd be so wonderful. We would collectively have so much more understanding of what's happening in the world and all of this kind of stuff. It's so cool, right? Yeah, it totally is. But then they said, quote, we hope this plan will inform policy, right? So what that means is you're taking this highest level of the law, subjugating to that policy process, right? And so in the ethical space, we're really trying to think through, well, what are the appropriate levels of that law? There's a lot more to be said in this particular framework, but I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just speed along. These are just graphs. If I don't have the little pen, I talk about that. This is one thing that I say, this work takes time, right? Like the building understanding, the application of these work within the dialogues of this notion of moving towards legal pluralism takes time. This is coming to the end now. This is just another shorthand for how we think about the decision-making of these two worldviews, right? And so what's typically happening in terms of how we're planning, I call this regional organizational strategy, can be whatever, this sort of exemplified by these ideas of theory of change or your typical planning. We come out of our Masters of Science educations, we come out of our planning schools with this embodied assumption that the decisions we make will impact the outcomes of natural systems, right? So we say, if we're say on the environmental side, or we could say different if we're on a mining side, we want clean water. So we are identifying an outcome, right? And so then this theory of change or these planning regimes are like, what decisions do we need to make to ensure this system outcome, clean water, right? And so you'll see your flowcharts and theory of change or whatever mechanism, right? But we're all coming out of our systems of understanding with that assumption that what we do changes the outcome of a natural system for better or worse. And so what happens on the Indigenous side is that outcome has already been determined by the legal authority itself. For example, water in the Okanagan case says, I must be clean, right? And so the system outcome is already determined. The system determines its own outcome. Human decisions follow to be consistent with that predetermined outcome, right? So you have an inverse way of decision making. And this is why you have things like Wet'suwet'en, right? Like all the scientists, billions of dollars working on this assumption. We want to bring good ideas to these decisions. But the premise of the embodiment of the assumption is that we have the right to make those decisions, right? And so when we're in ethical space, we're really thinking about, and not about whether we should or shouldn't pick blueberries or not, right? But really about how do we reconcile this inverse nature of decision making, right? Can we have common goals? How do we explore those assumptions more deeply and recognizing that there's fundamental huge challenges when we're trying to, one, understand each other, and now two, develop sort of this notion of legal pluralism, right? So this is a little bit of my shorthand. Those are completely inverse kinds of things. And that's really, when we're thinking about roots of conflict, what we need to resolve, what we're trying to reconcile. And it comes from that highest level of authority, right? And I would just make a caveat. And Reg does too, like it's a cross-validation purpose at ethical space. It's not one is better than the other. These are two just really random manifestations of how human societies could form their behavioral structures from the infinite ether of the universe, right? So we're really moving away from that value judgment. But if we're trying to reconcile, then framing this understanding in this way, I think can be helpful. So I'm going to close now with this quote from Krishnamurti. I don't think he's a North American, but action has meaning only in relationship. And without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict. The understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. So there's a couple of points here is that without understanding relationship, there's no alternative but conflict. And in the case of Indigenous relationships, those relationships are not only the relationships between you and I, or human society to human society, they're the relationships that are characterizing the Indigenous set of relationships between animals and themselves, between plants and themselves and animals, between animals, plants, and the humans and the water and all of the thing that has spirit, including in the Cree context, rocks, for example. So without understanding all of those relationships, you will have no alternative but conflict. And I think in terms of ethical space and framing out some of those behavioral requirements, directives, i.e. laws and stuff like that, it's really important to think there. I'll close and wrap with that. Thanks for listening to this uber short presentation of ethical space.